Hey legends! Welcome to Beyond Hogwarts. Buckle up for today's story. Selene was Harry's mother instead of Lily and Moon Goddess, raised him as immortal god of night magic. A like and subscribe goes a long way. Now let's jump in. Chapter 1: The Crescent Before the Storm. Before there were words for the dark between stars, before the first witch struck the first spark from the first stone and called it magic, before the island that would become Britain had been named or walked or wept over, the moon moved. It moved in the way it had always moved, indifferent to the calendars built around it, indifferent to the temples and the tides and the prayers folded into small paper shapes and sent skyward. It moved because it had always moved, and because its nature was motion at the edge of stillness, the way a held breath is motion at the edge of breath. Selene guided it the way a hand guides water in a bowl, not by force, not by effort, but by the understanding of the thing's own inclination. She had ruled the lunar sphere since before the word rule existed. This was not a boast, it was geography. The boy she had made sat on the pale surface of that sphere and watched the earth turn, and the earth, as it had always done, carried its freight of small bright violences without pause. His name was Harry. Not the boy who lived, which was a mortal invention, a taxonomy of survival that reduced the fact of him to the shape of the miracle rather than the substance. Not the heir of Potter, which was a legalism, a pedigree notation, a way of filing a person into a family tree and pretending the tree was the person. Not the thing the old prophecy called him, which was the one with the power to vanquish, which was accurate in the way that calling the ocean the thing that makes ships wet was accurate, true, technically, and entirely insufficient. His name was Harry, and he was 17 years old in the mortal reckoning, and he sat on the moon and watched. He was lean where his father had been broad, and pale where James Potter's photographs showed wind-bitten warmth. He wore dark clothes that moved like water and refused to catch light. At his throat a disc of silver, Selene's silver, given at birth, worn without ceremony, lay flat against his skin. His hair did what it had always done, which was to refuse gravity in all directions simultaneously, standing away from his head in the manner of something that has decided the word down is optional. His eyes were silver, not gray, which is what silver looks like when it is tired. Silver, which is what the interior of a mirror looks like when it has spent 17 years reflecting only the moon. The earth below turned blue and white. On its surface, within the tight cold island to the northwest, the magical world was conducting a war. Or rather, the magical world was conducting the aftermath of a war that had technically ended and had actually not ended at all. The way fires are never actually out until someone has spent a long time watching them with their hands on the bucket. A man who had decided death was optional had decided wrongly in 1981. Had been expelled from his body by the refusal of a 15-month-old child to die on schedule, had spent 13 years as less than a ghost, had spent the subsequent years accumulating a body again from ceremonial components and bad intentions. He was in Wiltshire now. Harry knew this the way he knew the positions of all significant magical masses on the island, by attention, by the long practice of watching from above, by the way the magical field of Britain warped slightly around things that carried enough power to bend the ambient. Voldemort was a significant mass. Not in Harry's reckoning. In Harry's reckoning, Voldemort was a moderately large thing in a very large universe, but significant in the mortal sense, the way a storm is significant to people who live at sea level. Harry felt the scar's fragment shift in its amber sleep. He pressed 2 fingers against the crescent ridge on his forehead and examined the interior of the scar, the way one examines a room through a keyhole, aware of the space, disinclined to enter it. The fragment was there. It had always been there. A small, furious, impotent shard of a mortal soul, lodged in a vessel that was almost entirely incompatible with it, unable to whisper, unable to leech, unable to perform any of the functions it had been designed to perform, because the environment around it was not a human mind with human vulnerabilities but a celestial space, cold and total and unyielding. The fragment sat in it the way an insect sits in amber, preserved, present, unable to do anything about either condition. It pulsed twice. recognizing the proximity of its origin signal, wherever Voldemort was directing his attention this morning. Harry removed his fingers. The fragment subsided. He returned his attention to the earth. They have sent a formal delegation. Selene's voice arrived the way her voice always arrived, from the silence itself, as if the silence had chosen to speak, as if the quiet had simply decided to organize itself into language and meaning. She settled beside him on the pale surface, and the light that surrounded her was the light she was made of, and it cast no shadow because it was not reflected light but source light. And Harry had grown up next to it the way a plant grows toward a lamp it has known all its life, naturally, entirely, without requiring instruction. She was vast, not in measurement, in implication. Standing next to Selene, you understood, in the wordless way that truth arrives before its articulation, that the word large was built for objects, and the word vast was built for ideas, and she was the second thing. The old man, Harry said, not a question. He came himself. Selene looked at the earth without the particular quality mortals called concern. To the highland edge where the sphere is thin, he used the old vocative form, the Greek one, a pause. He is thorough. He would be. He stood in the wind for 40 minutes. She was quiet for a moment that had the quality of geological patience. He was sincere. Harry considered this. Sincerity in Dumbledore was the asset that made him genuinely dangerous. Not sincerity as performance, not the calculated warmth that served as operating surface, but the real thing, the place underneath the mechanism where the old man actually believed in what he was building. It was harder to resist than manipulation. Manipulation could be identified and set aside. Genuine belief required engagement. He wants me for the war, Harry said. He wants you for his war, Selene said. There is a distinction. I know the distinction. He had been turning it over for weeks, not with urgency, because urgency was a mortal rhythm, the rhythm of limited time pressing against desired outcome, and Harry's relationship to time was not that, but with the patience of something that takes an idea through all its implications before committing to a response. The war below was real. Voldemort was real, reconstituted and accruing power in Wiltshire. The people dying at the margins of it were real. The Longbottom parents in St. Mungo's in their permanent grey distance were real. Sirius Black, running his particular circuit of fugitive exhaustion around the edges of Britain, was real. The prophecy was also real. In the limited way prophecies were real, conditions and tendencies, not commands. Neither can live while the other survives. He had read it through the scar's contact with the one who had made himself its subject, had read it the way one reads a map, useful, approximate, not the territory itself. He was the territory. He had never been the map. I will go, Harry said. Selene was still in the way that mountains are still, not passive stillness, not the stillness of absence, but the active stillness of something that is very large and has decided to hold its position. She looked at the earth. She looked at it for a long time. The fragment, she said at last, contained the curse's residue. Inert. He said it without impatience. He had answered these questions before and would answer them again, because she was asking not from doubt but from the discipline of verification, from the practice of checking the thing you know to be true against the current reality rather than assuming the knowing is the same as the fact. He had learned this from her. He respected it. He will probe, she said, when he knows you are proximate. Then the probe will fail. Yes. She turned to look at him. Her attention was the full particular attention of a titan who had made a specific thing and knew it completely, and carrying it was not uncomfortable, but it was not lightweight either. I am not asking about the probe. Harry looked back at her. I am asking, she said, what you expect to find. The question was not about the war. He knew this. It was about the other thing, the question underneath all the tactical assessment, the one that had been present since the beginning, unaddressed because he was not yet sure of its shape. What do you find when you go down to the world your father came from? The world that made the woman who loved him and the friend who failed him and the enemy who tried to erase you? What do you find in the heavy, resistant air of the earth that has never been home? I will find what's there, Harry said. That is the point. Selene regarded him. She lifted one hand and placed her palm against the side of his head, not over the scar but beside it, where the skin was unmarked and cool and her touch was the temperature of the sky an hour before dawn, and she held it there for one long moment. "Come back," she said. He placed his hand over hers. The silver of her light met the silver of his disk, and for a second the lunar plane around them brightened by a fraction, the way a room brightens when two lamps are placed close together. Then he turned and stepped to the edge of the pale surface, and the dark between things received him, and he descended. The Highlands in September had the quality of something that has been beautiful for so long it no longer needed to announce itself. The mountains stood in their pewter patience under a sky that was deciding between cloud and clarity. The lochs lay flat and exact. The heather had gone the deep purple that meant the end of the season was approaching, the color of things in the last week of their particular excellence. Harry arrived between one breath of wind and the next, stepping from the dark into the cold mountain air with the adjustment that transit required, the shift from no gravity to gravity, from no atmosphere to atmosphere, from the absolute silence of the celestial sphere to the thick sensory complexity of an October morning in Scotland. He stood still for a moment and let his body complete the recalibration. The grass at his feet moved in the wind the way grass moved, ordinarily, entirely, with no awareness of or interest in what had just arrived among it. He walked north toward the structure he could sense through the ambient magical field. Old, enormous, layered, the accumulated magical mass of 4 centuries of intention. Hogwarts. He had seen it from above as a suggestion, as a geographical detail, as a cluster of warm light against the dark of the Highland night. From the ground it was different. From the ground it had scale and weight, and the particular authority of things that have been in one place long enough to become part of what the place means. He did not apparate. He walked, because walking was how you came to know the ground, and he wanted to know the ground. The magical field of Britain settled around him as he moved through it. It knew him in the way all large ambient fields know the things that move through them, registering mass, registering nature, adjusting. He felt the field's awareness of him the way you feel a large room's awareness of your entry, a settling, a redistribution. The country's magical architecture had been waiting, in the way large systems wait for things that are supposed to arrive. He walked for 2 hours. The sun came up behind cloud and threw no shadow. The castle knew before anyone did. At 3 a.m. on the 14th of September, Hogwarts underwent a single, comprehensive reorganization of its ambient magical field. Not dramatic, not violent. A restructuring, the way a building restructures its load distribution, when a very significant weight is placed at a new point. The castle had been built to recognize the magical signatures of everyone within its walls. It had been built to respond to power, to authority, to the specific frequencies of different kinds of magic. It had been built with the practical intelligence of very old things that have housed very many different kinds of person, and had developed, in 4 centuries of housing, a discrimination that went beyond the mechanical. It recognized Harry the way a body recognizes its own blood. The torches in the entrance corridor brightened. Not the way they brightened when a professor put a spell to them, not the managed, even illumination of applied magic. They brightened the way a fire brightens when it remembers what fire is. They burned silver for 30 seconds. Then they settled back to gold, but quieter, a gold that had revised its understanding of itself. The staircases, which were in the habit of moving constantly and without schedule, went entirely still. Every staircase in the building, not frozen, not magically locked, not prevented, but still, the way a conversation goes still when someone enters the room who changes the subject simply by being present. In the dungeons, Severus Snape, who was awake, as he was awake most nights at this hour, for reasons that had nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with the particular vigilance of a man who has lived inside a long deception for decades, felt the shift. He set his quill down. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man calibrating something. The magical pressure of the castle had changed in a way he could identify as changed, without being able to identify the category of the change, which was the most unsettling kind of change. He sat with it for a long moment, said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. In the headmaster's office, 7 different instruments began producing sounds they had not been built to produce. Dumbledore sat up from the papers he had been reviewing and looked at the instruments with the careful attention of a man who has spent decades watching indicators for exactly this kind of signal. His expression did not show surprise. It showed the complicated face of a man whose long-cultivated expectation is at last becoming present tense. He had expected at best 3 weeks. He had 2 weeks of patience left. He would not need them. Harry walked through Hogwarts alone and at his own pace, which was unhurried. He entered through the front gate, which opened when he reached it, not at his command, but in the way a door opens when the person approaching it is the person the door has been built for. He walked the entrance corridor, and the castle's awareness of him moved through the stonework like a current, ahead of him, as if introducing him to each successive part of itself. The torches still burned their quieter gold. The floor beneath his feet was old stone, cold and certain, carrying the weight of centuries in its grain. He found the astronomy tower by inclination rather than navigation. High points had always been natural to him, the instinct of something that had grown up in the highest place there was. He climbed the stairs without hurry and emerged at the apex and stood in the night air and looked out at the grounds that surrounded the castle, the sweep of dark lawn, the glint of loch water, the forbidden forest at the boundary like a solid thought, dark and patient, and overhead the sky that was entirely clear in the particular way Highland skies are clear when the weather has decided to be generous. The moon was full. He looked up at it and let it look back, and the looking back was his mother's attention, and he stood in that attention the way he had stood in it all his life. Not comforted exactly, the word was too small, more correctly, located, which was what her attention gave him, the specific knowledge of where he was in relation to everything else. Below him the forest moved, not with wind. The trees at the edge leaned back from the castle in the way of things making room for something they recognize as outside their category. He noted this. The creatures inside the forest, centaurs, deep in the interior, their magical signatures, the specific bright frequency of beings with prophetic sensitivity, had gone still, not fled. Stilled the way a congregation stills when the service begins. He turned from the view when he heard feet on the tower stairs. He turned with time to spare, because he had heard the feet before they reached the lower landing. Dumbledore emerged through the doorway. He wore deep purple, and his half-moon spectacles caught the moonlight. He was not carrying his wand. Harry registered the deliberateness of the not carrying, and set it aside in the file of things that were true and strategically motivated simultaneously, which was the file that most of Dumbledore's gestures belonged to. They looked at each other. Dumbledore was old in a way that mortal wizards reached rarely. Not frail, he held himself with the posture of someone who has never had reason to diminish, but genuinely old, the way things are old when they have carried weight for a very long time. His magic was diffuse and well-organized and present in the ambient the way weather was present, pervasive, layered, capable. The most powerful mortal wizard in Britain and probably in continental Europe. In the hierarchy of things Harry had to take seriously, he sat somewhere between significant and requiring engagement. "You are early," Dumbledore said. "You expected 3 weeks," Harry said. A pause. Something in the old man's careful composure shifted into something more honest, the relief that lived below the strategy. "I did." "I confess," he paused, choosing the next words with the specific care of a man who has learned that this conversation will not survive dishonesty. "I have been expecting you since the night your father—" "James Potter," Harry said. The old man absorbed this, the phrasing, the correction, the precision of it. "Since the night James Potter died," he said, and adjusted without commentary. "Since that night, I have understood that something would eventually bring us to this point. I had hoped to have the conversation under more planned circumstances. Plans are mortal preferences," Harry said. "I prefer my own schedule." Dumbledore looked at him with the full intensity of a mind that had spent 70 years measuring people. He looked for a long time without speaking, and what he found in Harry's direct silver attention, the completeness of it, the quality that was not aggression but was also not anything that could be deflected, registered in the old man's face as something between recognition and adjustment. "You want me for the war," Harry said. "I want you safe," Dumbledore said, and deployed the warmth, genuine warmth, Harry noted, not the calculated variety, which made it more complex to navigate. "There is a prophecy. I know the prophecy." Dumbledore stopped. "It was in Voldemort's mind," Harry said. "In the residue his curse left in the scar. I have had 17 years to read everything he carried in that moment. The prophecy, the intention. The specific quality of fear that drove him to a cottage in Godric's Hollow to kill a child he believed was a threat." He paused. "The prophecy is conditional, not compulsive. It describes a tendency, not a command." The old man was quiet. His face was doing the specific recalibration it did when the machinery of his preparation became insufficient to the current situation. Not defeated, not distressed, but adapting, with the speed of a genuinely exceptional mind encountering new information and choosing to use it rather than resist it. Harry found this of the things he had observed about Dumbledore from above genuinely admirable. "Then you understand," Dumbledore said, "the shape of the danger." "I understand what Voldemort believes," Harry said. "I understand what the magical world needs. I understand the architecture of the war and the positions of the pieces, and the fact that you have been attempting for the past year to build a coalition against a man who has already begun building a different kind of army." He looked at the old man directly. "What I have not determined is what any of this requires of me." Dumbledore opened his mouth. Harry held his gaze and the old man closed it, not because he had been stopped, but because the quality of Harry's attention, that total, unmanageable completeness of it, had displaced the prepared sentence the way a larger sound displaces a smaller one. "You look like him," Dumbledore said, and the layer that was always between Dumbledore and pure honesty dropped out of the sentence. "Extraordinarily like James." "No," Harry said. "He was not unkind, he was precise. I look like my mother, the hair is my father's. Everything underneath is hers." The old man looked at him for a very long time. "Will you stay?" he said at last, and the sentence had no mechanism in it, no calculated warmth, nothing that was trying to accomplish something. It was a genuine question, asked from the genuine place. Not as a soldier, not as the fulfillment of anyone's design. Simply, will you look, as you said? Will you be present long enough to understand what is actually here? Harry turned back to the view. The moon held its course. Below the castle, the forest stood in its patient dark. "I am already staying," he said. "I walked through your wards. I am standing in your tower. I sat in your entrance corridor for 20 minutes watching your castle remember things it had forgotten about itself." He paused. "I will look at the war. What I decide afterward is not determined by your requirements or your prophecy, or the shape of the hero your world has been preparing the space for." Dumbledore stood in the doorway of his own tower and looked at the back of this silver-eyed being who had walked through every ward on the school the way wind walks through a gate, not breaking the gate, not needing to, simply passing through because the gate's function did not apply to wind, and he was frightened. Not in the way a man is frightened of a threat, in the way a man is frightened of a true thing, which is rarer and more fundamental. He was also, underneath the fright, something more complicated. The feeling of a man who has been building toward a moment his entire adult life and is now standing in it. And the moment is not what he built toward but is nevertheless real. And reality has always, for Albus Dumbledore, been preferable to even the most carefully constructed alternative. He went back down the stairs without another word. Harry remained in the tower until the sky began its slow gray shift toward dawn, and watched the dark give itself over to morning, and the castle breathed beneath him, and did not ask him anything. Severus Snape encountered Harry at 6 the following morning in the corridor, outside the potions classroom. He had been briefed at 5, a short, bloodless briefing from Dumbledore that had consisted primarily of 3 sentences, the most significant of which was he arrived last night and walked through every ward on the school without triggering a single one, and had dressed with his usual precision and walked to the dungeons, and had spent the subsequent 40 minutes conducting an internal argument about whether he was or was not prepared for this particular conversation. He was not. He turned the corner and there was Harry Potter, reading the ingredient list pinned to the classroom door. Reading it with the complete, unhurried attention of someone for whom reading a third-year ingredient list was exactly as significant as anything else. which was to say, exactly as significant as it was, nothing more. Harry turned to look at him. Snape looked back. His face assembled itself into the configuration it wore under pressure, disdain over armor over something he did not name, and he said, "You are blocking my classroom." "The door is locked," Harry said. "It is my door," Snape said. "Then unlock it." Snape strode forward and drew his wand and unlocked the door with the force of a man asserting ownership and pushed through it, and Harry followed, which had not been an invitation. The classroom was cold. The preserved specimens in their jars ranged along the walls, pale shapes in pale liquid, and Harry looked at them with the same quality he gave everything. "You have your father's posture," Snape said. The sentence came from below the architecture of his self-presentation, and he resented it immediately. "People keep noting the resemblance," Harry said. He was looking at the jars. "It seems to distress them. James Potter has been dead for 16 years. The resemblance serves no practical function." Snape looked at him sharply. The phrasing was the kind that could only come from someone who had been outside the grief long enough to see its shape clearly, which was a specific kind of outside that Snape had never been able to occupy. "And yet here you are," Snape said, which was not what he had intended to say but was what his honest register produced. "In Britain, at Hogwarts." "For what exactly?" "To look," Harry said. He moved along the line of jars with the patient attention of a cataloger. "The same reason anyone comes to examine something, to determine its nature." "We are not specimens," Snape said, and the acid was fully deployed, which was his distance mechanism, his way of taking up the space where other people kept their warmth and filling it with something that kept others back. "The magical world is not a collection for your review." Harry stopped at a jar near the end of the shelf. Inside it, a piece of boomslang skin had the particular dry, papery look of desiccation, losing structural integrity, beginning the slow dissolution of something that had not been properly maintained. "The magical world is precisely what I am treating it as," Harry said. He turned from the jar. "An observable phenomenon with patterns and pressures and a specific crisis point approaching. What else would I treat it as?" Snape looked at him. The acid had found nowhere to purchase. It had slid off the surface of that silver attention and pooled on the floor and was now simply liquid, no longer a defense. "Home," Snape said. It came out with a flatness that was its own kind of precision. "You might treat it as home." Harry looked at him. The look was the full version, the complete version, the one that took the measure of a thing without judgment and without hurry. "I have a home," he said. "I was not looking for another." "Then what?" Snape stopped himself. The question beneath the question was trying to surface, and he was holding it under, but it was visible, the way things held underwater are visible. He turned to his workbench and began arranging his instruments, with the careful, unnecessary precision of a man creating controlled distance. "You are his spy," Harry said. The instruments went still. Snape turned. He looked at Harry with the specific look of a man who has been named accurately in a vulnerable spot and is deciding in real time whether to deny or confirm, and the decision took less than 2 seconds, which was, Harry noted, remarkably fast for a practiced spy. "I am Dumbledore's operative within Voldemort's inner circle," Snape said, with the clipped exactness of a man using formal language as containment. "If you intend to broadcast that, why would I broadcast it?" Harry said. The question was genuine. It's operationally significant. "I have noted it and will use it appropriately." Snape stared at him. "Use it. The information about your position will be relevant when Voldemort moves," Harry said, "which he will. The details of how I use the knowledge are not determined yet, but I do not discard useful positions." He paused, and his voice went to something that was still level, still precise, but had shifted in temperature by a fraction, not warmer, but less absent. "You chose it," he said. "The position. Whatever the reasons were, they were yours, and the choice is not a small one. I find I have no contempt for people who make difficult choices for reasons they consider adequate." Snape's jaw experienced the specific muscular event of a man who has just received something he had no protocol for receiving. He looked at the wall of jars for a long time. "The boomslang skin," Harry said. He indicated the jar at the end of the shelf. "Third jar. It's desiccated. You'll want to replace it before the fourth years get to it." He moved to the door. At the threshold he stopped, not turning. "I do not know yet what I will decide about the war," he said. "I want you to know that I have noted the costs of your position, and that they register as real. Not many people will say that to you." He paused. "The ones who should have said it and didn't, that is their failure, not your debt." Then he was gone, and the corridor outside the classroom was empty, and the door swung closed on its own, and Snape stood in his dungeon with the carefully maintained architecture of his contempt slightly but permanently reorganized, and looked at the jar with the desiccated boomslang skin, and after a very long time went and took it down from the shelf. The students arrived on the 1st of September in the manner of students, in the boats and carriages, and with the particular energy of 400 young people who have been apart for a summer and have a great deal to report to one another. They flooded into the entrance hall and the great hall and distributed themselves across their tables and talked at the pitch that 400 young people talking about things that matter to 400 young people produces. A bright, layered, complicated sound that said we are here, and this is where we belong in the specific dialect of community. Harry sat at the end of the staff table nearest the door. He sat because Dumbledore had placed a chair there, and because the chair was where Harry was, and he was not a student, and the logic of the arrangement was the logic of where one puts things that exceed the established categories, somewhere visible, somewhere acknowledged, in a position that functioned as neither one thing nor another. He had not changed his clothes. He wore the dark things that moved like water. The lunar disc lay flat at his throat. His hands rested on the table, and he watched the doors and the students, and the staff taking their seats, and the enormous enchanted ceiling overhead, which showed the night sky with its reliable accuracy, and which was, Harry noted, doing something slightly unusual. The stars in it were burning at full magnitude rather than the softened version the enchantment usually produced, as if the ceiling had been reminded by his presence of what actual stars looked like. The students came in and saw him, and the talking dropped several registers. Not to silence, not immediately, but to something more careful, more provisional. The specific drop in volume that happens when a room collectively decides to reassess a situation. He did not perform unapproachability. He sat in the natural state of himself, which happened to be a state the ambient magical field of the room recognized, and responded to in a way that the students did not yet have precise language for. The candles in the great hall did not turn silver, but they burned without flicker, entirely still, in a room that had 400 students in it, not one of whom was sitting completely motionless. And fire without flicker in a room full of motion is the kind of thing you notice without knowing why you've noticed it. The sorting proceeded. The first years came in looking terrified and hopeful in equal measure, which was the standard ratio. The sorting hat was placed on each head and rendered its judgment with the confidence of something that has been doing the same thing for 5 centuries and does not find it tedious. When the hat was placed on a small, dark-haired girl, 7th in the line, it sat for 5 seconds without speaking. 6, 8. The hall went gradually quiet. 10 seconds was an eternity in sorting terms. Then the hat said in its carrying, deliberately public voice, "Ravenclaw," and then, in the tone of something making a considered announcement. And I would observe, for the record, that there is present in this hall tonight a consciousness I was not built to categorize, and I will be declining to speculate on its nature, since anything I said would be both true and inadequate. The hall was entirely silent for 3 full seconds. Dumbledore began to applaud for the Ravenclaw girl, with the gracious timing of a man who has decided to incorporate the extraordinary into the program, without breaking the program's rhythm. The applause followed, because Dumbledore's authority over the momentum of Hogwarts moments was the authority of a conductor who has been standing in front of this particular orchestra for so long that the musicians respond before they think. The sorting continued. The feast materialized on the tables with the usual abundance and the usual magic. Harry ate sparingly. The food at Hogwarts had the quality of all food prepared with consistent intention. It exceeded its own ingredients, the way a song exceeds its notes. He noted this without being altered by it. Across the hall, students looked at him, some in the covert way of people who want information and believe their looking is undetectable, some with the frank gaze of the young, who have not yet learned that staring is socially complicated. Some with the specific look of people who have heard something, or read something, or whose parents have said something, and are now matching the information against the reality, and finding that the matching process has not produced the expected result. He met each look directly when it came to him, and returned it, and the returning of it was what caused the students to look away, not from hostility, not from anything they could name, but because sustained eye contact with something that is paying complete attention, the kind of attention that does not multitask, that does not have a part of itself elsewhere, is very difficult to hold. Most people's looking is half looking. Harry's looking was total. It was the attention of something that, when it gave you its attention, gave you all of it, and all of it was more than most people knew how to receive. Minerva McGonagall, placed beside him by the seating arrangement with the resigned composure of a woman who has been a deputy headmistress for 30 years, and has therefore faced a considerable range of the unexpected, said nothing for 22 minutes. When she finally spoke, it was with the clipped directness that was her register for situations she intended to handle professionally. "Do you require anything?" "No," Harry said. "Rooms have been," she stopped. He looked at her. "Have you found the rooms?" "I found rooms," Harry said, "the topmost tower, wide stone floors. A window with a view in every direction." The castle had had them ready, not prepared, in the sense of pillows arranged and fire lit, but ready, in the structural sense of a space that had been kept empty for long enough that it had developed a specific gravity around itself, the gravity of a vacancy that knows it is not permanent. McGonagall absorbed this in the way she absorbed things she could not usefully interrogate, by noting it, filing it accurately, and moving to the next item. "And she paused, choosing between several sentences. "The forest is in good form this year for October." "September," Harry said. "Yes." She looked at him with an expression that had made a decision partway through its development, arriving at something that was neither the concern she had started with nor the professional neutrality she had aimed for, but a third thing, the thing that specific kinds of exceptional students occasionally produced in her, a response that was not prepared, that lived below the preparation. "Yes, September." "The forest is healthy," Harry said. "The centaur herd in the northern section is in good condition. They went quiet when I arrived." McGonagall looked at the enchanted ceiling, which continued to show full-magnitude stars that no one present had asked for. She said, "They are notoriously difficult, the centaurs. They have opinions about events they won't explain." "Prophets usually do," Harry said. "They're speaking true things that haven't become sentences yet. It's a frustrating intermediate state." She looked at him, he looked at the hall. "You are not," she said after a moment, "what I expected." "I know." He watched a pair of second years attempt to use the Wingardium Leviosa charm on a piece of bread, unsuccessfully, and then look at each other with the conspiratorial delight of people whose failure has become more interesting than success would have been. "No one I have met here has been." The feast went on around them. The stars on the ceiling burned with their unasked-for accuracy. The students talked and ate, and performed the intricate social negotiations of young people establishing and re-establishing their positions in a community, which is one of the things humans did constantly, and which Harry found, if he was being precise about it, genuinely interesting. The extraordinary complexity of belonging as an active project. The amount of work that went into maintaining one's membership in a group that had no cosmic requirement to include you. He watched it for a long time. Somewhere in the south of England, in a house in Wiltshire that was too large and too cold, and had been made to feel appropriate to a man who found grandeur functional rather than comfortable, Voldemort sat in the high-backed chair and let his legitimacy reach northward. It struck the scar and bounced. The surface it encountered was not a ward, not a defense, not a spell, not the kind of thing a mortal mind constructs when it is trying to protect itself. It was a surface, the way the moon's surface is a surface, the exterior of something that simply was what it was, without agenda or resistance, without the vulnerability that resistance implies. Trying to find purchase on it was the attempt to find purchase on a thing that had not been built with purchase in mind. Voldemort pulled back. He was still in his chair for a very long time. Around him, his Death Eaters went careful and small, reading the quality of his silence the way animals read the weather. He began to think, with the careful precision of a man who has survived long enough to know that what he does not understand is more dangerous than what he does. He had made an error in Godric's Hollow. Not in the decision had been strategically correct given his information, but in the assessment. He had assessed the infant as a mortal child with unusual magical potential, and had treated it accordingly. The scar fragment, which should have functioned as a reporting mechanism and a channel, was instead sitting in something that felt like amber, preserved and inert, unable to report anything, unable to receive anything. He needed the fragment recovered. He needed to understand what he had cursed. He needed, before he moved against the North, to understand what the North actually contained. He would be thorough. In the Great Hall, Harry felt the probe arrive and the probe rebound and felt Voldemort's awareness register the failure, and noted it, and returned his attention to the students finishing their dinner. A first-year boy, small, with the look of someone who has spent the summer being told that Hogwarts was going to be magnificent, and is now discovering that magnificent includes several varieties of terrifying, looked across the hall at Harry with the open, direct, uncurated gaze of the very young and very curious, and Harry looked back, and the boy, rather than looking away, gave a single, very serious nod. As if confirming something, Harry nodded back. The boy's face underwent a small revolution of emotion that ended in something satisfied, and he returned to his food. Harry looked at the ceiling. The stars burned there in their accurate positions, every one of them where it should be, none of them where human preference had decided to put them. The enchanted ceiling showed what was true, not what was comfortable, and in that regard Harry found it the most honest surface in the building. Above it, beyond the castle and the highland sky and the cold, clear air of the September night, the moon held its course. It had always held its course. That was the thing about the moon. It did not depend on being noticed to proceed. It moved through its appointed arc regardless of whether anyone below was watching, regardless of whether the watching was reverent or incurious or hostile, regardless of whether the world it illuminated was having a good century or a terrible one. It moved because it was what it was, and because being what it was required the moving. Harry understood this in the way he understood everything his mother had taught him, not as information, but as nature. Not as something he had learned, but as something he was made of. He was here to look. He was looking. Below, the war arranged its pieces on the board it had been building since before he was born, and the pieces moved with the urgency of mortal things moving toward mortal ends. And the moon held its course, and Harry held his, and the night continued, deep and exact and indifferent to the requirements of prophecy. He placed his hands flat on the table. The wood beneath his palms was old and honest, worn smooth by decades of students, carrying the compressed history of meals and arguments and 17-year-olds writing notes to each other in margins, carrying the particular density of things that have been used, genuinely used, for a very long time. He pressed. The wood held. The wood had always held this weight and would hold his. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. Chapter 2. What the Moon Remembers. The Ministry sent 3 Aurors and a form on the second Monday of September, which was the kind of institutional response that reveals more about the institution than it does about the situation it is responding to. The form was 3 pages long, and had been drafted in 48 hours by a junior clerk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement named Hopkirk. Not Mafalda Hopkirk of the improper use of magic office, but her cousin Gerald, who had a reputation for procedural thoroughness and a complete absence of imagination, which combination made him ideal for the work of producing documents, and catastrophically unsuited for the work of understanding why some documents should not be produced. Gerald Hopkirk had compiled his report from 6 sources, including the Hogwarts Sorting Hat's public declaration, a letter from a Hufflepuff parent whose daughter had written home about the candles, an anonymous tip from someone in the Wisengamot's administrative wing who had heard Dumbledore's name in connection with a divine entity, and had decided this was the ministry's business rather than the school's, and a brief from the Department of Mysteries that consisted entirely of the words "we are aware," followed by 3 inches of heavily redacted text that somehow managed to communicate very little and be deeply unsettling about it. The form was titled Declaration of Extraordinary Magical Entity Status, Domestic or Visiting, and had boxes for name, age, wand registration, last known address, and nature of extraordinary capacity, and a box at the bottom, added apparently at the last minute in a slightly different ink, which read, Divine or Semi-Divine Classification, if applicable. Circle 1, verified / probable / uncertain / contested. The three aurors were Dawlish, Proudfoot, and a young woman named Williamson whose wand hand was the only part of her that was visibly unsure about the assignment. They arrived at the front gate at 9 in the morning, which was correct form. Aurors arrived at front gates at 9 in the morning when executing a registration decree. The form required it. Harry was already there. He was standing in the gateway when they landed, which they had not expected, and the unexpectedness of it cost Dawlish the opening 3 seconds of his prepared presentation, which were the 3 seconds on which the tone of the entire interaction depended. He recovered himself quickly. Dawlish was a professional, and professionals absorbed the unexpected without audible adjustment. But the 3 seconds were gone, and the tone they had established in their absence was not the tone of ministry authority proceeding as planned. Harry looked at the three of them with the quality of attention that was simply his quality of attention, complete, unhurried. The morning sun was cold and exact, and put their shadows long on the path behind them. Dawlish extended the form. Mr. Potter, by authority of Ministry Decree 7100 and, I know what it says, Harry said. Dawlish held the form in the air for a moment that became progressively less authoritative the longer it lasted. You'll need to complete and return this to the Department of... No, Harry said. A silence. Proudfoot shifted his weight slightly to the right, which was the physical adjustment of a man reconsidering his position. Williamson, whose wand hand had arrived unsure and was now settling into something more definitively opposed to the idea of drawing, looked at the lunar disk at Harry's throat with the focused attention of someone who has recognized something and is deciding what the recognition means. Mr. Potter, Dawlish said, and the authority in his voice had firmed up the way a man firms up when he understands that the first approach has produced no purchase, and the second approach must be unmistakably clear. You are subject to mandatory registration under the terms of... I am subject to nothing your ministry can decree. Harry's voice had not changed. It had not gone cold exactly. Cold implied a temperature withdrawn, and his voice had no temperature to withdraw. It was simply precise, the precision of a thing stating its own nature without apology or aggression. The Ministry of Magic governs a human society. It derives its authority from the consent and participation of that society's members. I am not a member. I was not born to membership. My mother's sovereignty does not acknowledge British ministerial jurisdiction, and neither do I, he paused. If Cornelius Fudge wishes to contest this, he knows where I am. Dawlish opened his mouth. I'm not hiding, Harry said. I am easy to find. I'm standing here now in front of you. If the ministry wants a conversation, the minister may come and have one. He took the form from Dawlish's extended hand. He looked at it once, at the box that said uncertain, specifically, at the fact that someone had thought uncertain was an adequate category, and handed it back. Tell Gerald Hopkirk that his form requires a fourth option. Dawlish held the form. He looked at Proudfoot. Proudfoot looked at Williamson. Williamson had already put her wand away, the motion complete and quiet, the decision made somewhere below the level of deliberation. The minister will hear about this, Dawlish said, and the sentence had the quality of sentences produced when all other sentences have been exhausted. Technically true, functionally empty, a way of leaving the field while still facing forward. Good, Harry said. He stepped back from the gate. The gate swung closed in the way a door closes when the wind shifts and the latch catches. No magic applied. No gesture made. The motion simply the motion of a gate returning to its default state, because the conversation requiring its open position was over. He walked back up the path toward the castle without looking back, and behind him, he heard the sound of 3 broomsticks lifting from the ground, which was the sound of institutional certainty retreating to the place where it could consult a supervisor. The fourth-year defense against the dark arts class met on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the third-floor classroom that faced east, which meant the morning light came through the windows at an angle that illuminated the floating dust of chalk and old parchment, and made the room look, at certain hours, as if it were already remembering itself. Harry came on Thursday. Dumbledore had asked, with the specific quality of a man making a request he understands can be refused, and is prepared to accept that refusal, whether Harry would consider attending some classes. For context, the old man had said, deploying the word with the care of a practiced presenter leading with the least contestable framing. Harry had considered this for 6 hours and decided that context was accurate. He wanted to know the shape of what he was examining. He had chosen defense specifically, and for the reason he had given no one, which was that defense against the dark arts was the course that concerned itself most directly with the category of thing he was deciding about. The professor was a temporary appointment, a ministry liaison named Caro, whose presence at Hogwarts Harry suspected, was not unconnected to the ministry's desire to have a reportable observer on the premises. Caro had not been told Harry would be attending. He entered the classroom, looked at his register, looked up, found Harry seated in the front row, and performed the rapid internal reorganization of a man whose day has just exceeded its authorized parameters. He did not ask. He began the lesson. The lesson was on boggarts. Harry found boggarts genuinely interesting, and not for the reason the lesson thought they were interesting. The lesson thought they were interesting because of the charm, ridiculous, the mechanism of transformative humor, fear converted to absurdity. The mechanism was elegant and demonstrated something true about the relationship between fear and imagination. But the interesting thing about boggarts to Harry was not the charm. It was the mechanism beneath the charm. A boggart was a creature that read its observer's definition of loss and inhabited it. It was the most honest thing in the curriculum. Every other creature in the syllabus had its own nature, its own agenda, its own category of being. The boggart had only the nature the observer brought to it. It was a mirror that showed the one specific thing the mirror was not supposed to show, not what you were, but what you were most unwilling to lose. Harry had been wondering, since arriving at Hogwarts, what a boggart would show him. He had turned the question over with the patient curiosity he gave to things he could not immediately categorize. The mechanism required a definition of loss held at the observer's deepest level, not a conscious fear, but an architectural one, the kind built into the load-bearing structure of a person's relationship to existence. He had examined his own architecture with the thoroughness of someone who had been given 17 years, and the silence of the celestial sphere to do the examining. He was not afraid of death, because death as mortals meant it did not apply to him in the usual forms. He was not afraid of pain, because pain was information and information was useful. He was not afraid of Voldemort or the ministry or the war below. The question of what he was afraid of produced an absence where an answer should be, and he had decided this was not the absence of fear, but the absence of completed fear. A fear that had not yet found its final form because the situation that would define it had not yet fully arrived. He noted this and set it aside. In the third row, Neville Longbottom was watching him. Longbottom had been watching him since Tuesday. Harry had noted it the way he noted all persistent attention, as data. Longbottom watched him the way people watch things that have reorganized their benchmarks for significant, which was a specific and interesting quality of watching. Not all which was passive and a little helpless, something more active, an attempt at understanding the perimeter of the thing observed. When the lesson ended, Harry remained in his seat until the classroom was empty. Longbottom stopped at the door, turned back with the particular physical decision of a person who has chosen to stop moving away from something and move toward it instead. "Are you actually hers?" he said, not quite a question. The sentence had the shape of a question and the weight of a statement. "Selene's." "Yes," Harry said. Longbottom absorbed this with the deliberate care of someone who has learned to take time with important information. "I read about her in third year, Mythological Foundations of Ancient Magic. She was in the chapter on Titan sovereignty." He paused. "The book said she was. It said the word lunar comes from her. That the concept of the moon as a governing force, the thing that moves tides and marks time, that's not metaphor." That's just describing her. That is accurate, Harry said. And the prophecy, Longbottom said. The prophecy was written about a condition, not a conclusion, Harry said. It has two possible subjects. You are one of them. Longbottom looked at him with the expression of a person receiving information they have half suspected for a long time. I know, he said. Professor Dumbledore told me last year. He said Voldemort chose you, so he said it was resolved. A pause. Is it resolved? The prophecy points, Harry said. It does not compel. What happens after the pointing depends on decisions that have not yet been made. Neville Longbottom stood in the doorway and looked at Harry with the frank, assessing attention of someone who has survived a very great deal of being underestimated and has developed, as a result, the particular kind of clear-eyed directness that only grows in people who have had to look at difficult things without flinching for a long time. They killed my parents, he said, not dramatically. The way you say a thing you have said too many times for the saying to still require ceremony. Bellatrix Lestrange and the others. My parents are alive, but they don't know me. They don't know anyone. He held Harry's gaze. I'm not telling you that so you'll do something. I'm telling you because you said you came to look, and that's part of what there is to look at. Harry held this. The weight of it, the precision of a piece of information offered without agenda, without negotiation, which was rarer in human communication than it should be. I know, Harry said. Is it? Longbottom stopped himself, decided, started again with the honest sentence. Does it matter to you? Yes, Harry said. The word sat in the air of the classroom in the chalk dust light in the floating old building silence. Longbottom heard it the way he heard precise things, which was completely, without the buffer of interpretation. And what he understood was that the word was not reassurance and was not performance and was not the correct social response to a difficult disclosure. It was just accurate, an accounting entry. True. He nodded once and left, and Harry sat for a long time in the emptied classroom while the morning light moved across the floor, and thought about the Longbottom parents in their gray distance, and thought about Bellatrix Lestrange in Azkaban, and thought about what matters meant in the architecture of a decision still being assembled. The probe came at midnight on the 17th. He was on the tower, which was where he was most nights past 10. The tower was his, not by formal claim but by the pressure of consistent presence, the way a chair becomes a particular person's chair by the repeated fact of them being in it, when the scar's amber freight shifted. Not woke, shifted. A vibration in the structure of the thing, the way a crystal vibrates at its resonant frequency when the right sound enters the room. The fragment was responding to an external signal, the sympathetic pull of its origin reaching out through the ambient magical field of Britain, threading through ley lines and the residual traces of old spells and the cold October air, following the frequency of itself. Harry placed 2 fingers against the crescent scar and felt the tendril arrive. It was not Voldemort's consciousness. It was operational magic, a fragment of Horcrux intent sent without awareness, a seeking spell built from the same soul material as the shard in the scar, designed to locate and assess and report back. It had the quality of all such things, purposeful, directionless without its purpose, exactly as dangerous as its objective and no more. It found the scar, it entered, Harry exhaled, the corridor around him went dark, not unlit, not the passive dark of a room with no lamp. The active dark, the color that black becomes when it performs its full function, when it is not the absence of light but the presence of the thing that makes light meaningful. The dark of deep space. His dark, the dark his mother had taught him to inhabit the way a singer inhabits a held note, completely, from the inside, understanding it as a place rather than an absence. The tendril of Horcrux intent entered the dark and found no geography, no edges, no exits, nothing to probe because there was nothing that had been built with probing in mind. It found the shard in its amber, and the amber was part of the dark, and the dark was part of Harry, and none of these things were accessible in the way the tendril had been designed to access things. The tendril's response function for environments it could not process was retreat. It retreated. Harry let the dark retract. It went the way it came, not switched off, but concluded, the way a held note concludes when the singer finishes the phrase. The corridor reasserted itself around him. The torches, which had gone out, relit from farthest to nearest, each flame lower than before, each one smaller and more careful, as if the air around them was still deciding whether the dark had truly finished its business. Through the scar's connection, he felt the tendrils' failure register in Wiltshire. Not Voldemort's panic was not something the Dark Lord did in response to information, only in response to situations beyond information, but Voldemort's stillness, which was more significant. The stillness of a man setting aside his current framework and opening a new one. Harry sat on the tower stairs and let Voldemort build his revised assessment. The Dark Lord was learning 3 things: that the scar fragment could not be used as a channel, that the vessel was not a human mind with human vulnerabilities, that whatever had deflected the killing curse in 1980, one was still present and still functional, and was not a shield spell or a charm or any mechanism that could be identified and countered by the methods available to a wizard, however powerful, who had constructed his entire magical practice on the principle that all defenses could be broken by sufficient force applied at the right angle. The third thing was the most important. Voldemort was learning the limit of his own methodology. Harry had not designed this as a lesson, but if Voldemort was thorough, and he was, and Harry had always credited him for it, he would draw the correct conclusion from the failed probe, that the thing in the north was not a more powerful version of the same category of being, that it was a different category entirely. That kind of understanding in an opponent was genuinely dangerous. An opponent who knew what you were and began adjusting their approach accordingly was more difficult than an opponent who underestimated you. Harry had no particular concern about the danger, but he noted it, and the noting of it was its own kind of respect for the situation's complexity. He began to decide. Not the decision, not yet, not the full architecture of what he would do when Voldemort moved, but the preliminary decisions, the ones that shaped the conditions for the larger one. He thought about the Longbottom parents. He thought about the centaurs in the northern forest, their astrological reading that had not yet become a sentence. He thought about what Snape's position required, and what Dumbledore's position would cost him, and what Sirius Black was running toward in his circuits around the edge of Britain. He thought about his mother's hand against the side of his head. Come back. He sat on the stairs for a long time. The torches burned their careful small flames. The castle breathed its enormous patient breathing around him, and the stone of the stairwell was cold against his back, and the cold was honest, as cold always was. Sirius Black came through the tunnel under the Whomping Willow on the 20th of September at 2 in the morning, in the form of a large black dog that was thinner than it should have been and moved with the specific urgency of something that has been running toward a thing for a long time and has finally resolved to stop running around it. He changed back to human in the passages dark and stood breathing. He had a plan. He had been constructing the plan for 2 years, refining it through 17 revisions, discarding and rebuilding it through 3 failed attempts to return to Britain, and 1 successful attempt that had ended with him standing outside Hogwarts in the rain at 11 at night, unable to move. The plan in its current form was: find Harry, tell him about James, the real James, not the file, not the photographs, not the dead hero version that the magical world had assembled from his best moments and most convenient characteristics. Tell him about James as he had actually been, flawed and warm and stupidly brave and entirely irreplaceable, and say I was his best friend and I was supposed to be your godfather, and let that mean what it meant. He had been rehearsing variations of this speech for the entire transit through the tunnel. He emerged into the grounds in his dog form, because the grounds had fewer human eyes at this hour, and the dog form was faster and more practical for the crossing. And he ran low across the grass and found a shadow at the castle wall, and changed back and stood in the shadow with the cold September air, and the moonlight, and the specific feeling of a man who has finally arrived at the thing he has been postponing. He entered through a side passage he had memorized 30 years ago, when I know every secret passage in this castle had been a point of pride rather than a survival skill, and climbed 2 floors, and turned the corner into the east corridor and stopped. Harry was standing 20 feet away, not waiting, not positioned in the corridor with the air of someone who had been expecting him. Simply there, the way things in castles are simply there at 2 in the morning when they have not gone to sleep because sleep. for them, was not the same category of necessity. Sirius changed back to human, because standing in front of James's son as a dog was not how this went. The change happened faster than it needed to, the impulse of a man who wants to be seen as himself rather than as a shape, who wants the conversation to happen between people. He stood in the corridor in his traveling clothes, which were dirty and thin at the elbows, and looked at Harry, and Harry looked at him. The rehearsed speech did not present itself. It did not present itself because the speech had been built for a particular face, a face he had constructed from the one photograph he had of James holding an infant Harry, 5 months old, all dark tufted hair and unfocused gaze, and the face in front of him was not that face. The eyes were silver, not green, not the warm, dark eyes of a man who could charm anyone in the room before they'd notice being charmed. Silver, like the inside of something that has reflected the moon for 17 years and taken on its nature. And the quality of the attention in them was not hostile, not warm, not any of the things he had planned for. It received him, completely without management. "You're Sirius Black," Harry said. The words that should have come next, "and you're James's son," closed in Sirius's throat. He stood with them closed there for 3 seconds. "You have his hair," he said, and his voice did something complicated on the word his. "It goes in all directions the same way. James used to spend 20 minutes every morning trying to make it do something different, and it never did anything different. Your grandmother thought it was deliberate, that he was doing it on purpose to annoy her, and he wasn't, that's just what it did." Harry waited. Sirius recognized the waiting. It was not the polite waiting of social obligation. It was the waiting of something that had given over its full attention and was in no hurry, that had allocated all of itself to this corridor and this moment, and was prepared to stay until the moment had finished itself naturally. He had never encountered that quality of waiting from a person before. He did not know what to do with it, and so he did the thing he always did when he did not know what to do, which was to keep talking. "Come in," Harry said, and turned and walked toward the tower stairs. Sirius followed because what else did you do? The room at the top of the tower was wide and bare. The stone floor held the cold the way old stone always did, storing it through the day, releasing it at night, maintaining its fundamental geological position on the question of temperature regardless of what was happening above it. The window was open to the September sky. No furniture. Harry sat on the wide stone sill and the moon came through behind him, framing him in the specific way the moon frames things at full magnitude on a clear night, completely without softness, every edge exact. Sirius sat on the floor. It did not occur to him to find this undignified. "Dumbledore didn't send you," Harry said. "No." Sirius ran one hand through his hair, which was the length it reached after 2 years of not cutting it and had developed its own opinions about direction. "He has ideas about timing. He thinks the situation requires careful management." He heard the acid in his own voice without trying to put it there. "I stopped managing carefully about 2 years ago." He looked at his hands. The ring was still loose. He needed to eat more. He knew he needed to eat more, but eating more required staying in one place long enough to acquire food with consistency, and staying in one place was the thing his body had decided was non-negotiable in the bad direction. "I was there," he said. "Not that night. I wasn't in Godric's Hollow. I was on an errand, running what we thought was a lead on someone in Voldemort's network, and it turned out to be nothing. It turned out to be exactly nothing, which is a particular kind of nothing because it means I was absent for a reason that didn't exist." He stopped. The sentence had started as preamble and had become its own wound. "James and we were supposed to switch. The secret keeper. I was supposed to be his, and at the last minute we switched to Peter because we thought." He put his head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and made a sound that was not language and did not need to be. "We thought we were being clever." Harry said nothing. The nothing was entire. "Peter Pettigrew," Harry said after a moment. "He is alive." Sirius's eyes came back down from the ceiling. "I know he stopped. "You know where he is?" "Wiltshire," Harry said. "He returned to a body 14 months ago." The implications of this arrived in Sirius's face in sequence, each one landing separately, each one requiring its own processing time. "He's with Voldemort." Not a question. He's been with Voldemort this whole time while I've been. He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. He had spent 2 years running, which was 2 years of a man's life. 2 years he would not get back. 2 years in which Peter Pettigrew had been warm and fed in Wiltshire, and Sirius had been eating what the countryside provided and sleeping rough and wearing out his knees in the dog form, because the dog form didn't remember Azkaban the way the human form did. Dumbledore knows, Harry said. Of course Sirius stopped again. The acid was back. He let it sit there, used it for what it was, a function rather than a feeling, a tool for maintaining the distance required to keep the session functional rather than disintegrating. Of course he knows, he said more quietly. Silence. Tell me about him, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. About Pettigrew. About James. It landed the way precise things landed, completely, with no warning, filling all available space. Sirius looked at the silver eyes, and what he found in them was not hunger, was not the neediness of someone who wanted something from the telling. It was something more fundamental, an open space. An attention that had allocated itself to whatever came next and would receive it exactly as it arrived. He talked. He talked about James at 15, stupid and brilliant, and entirely convinced of his own invulnerability in the way that 15-year-old boys who are good at everything are entirely convinced of their invulnerability, which is the most annoying and the most lovable thing about them. He talked about James at 17, when the invulnerability had started to develop into something more considered, when the pranks had begun to have a conscience attached to them, when Lily Evans had said something to him in the corridor. Sirius had not heard it. He had only seen the aftermath, which was James standing very still with the expression of a man who has been handed an exact description of himself and finds it accurate and uncomfortable, and James had been, for approximately 3 days, entirely unlike himself, which was the closest James Potter had ever come to genuine humility, and which had resolved, on the 4th day, into determination rather than humility, which was much more characteristic. He talked about the flat they had shared the year after school, which had been too small for 2 people who both had opinions about everything, and expressed those opinions at full volume. He talked about the time James had tried to cook a proper Sunday dinner using only magic, and the kitchen had responded as kitchens, due to the injudicious application of fire-starting charms to large quantities of oil. And about the 3 hours they had spent charming the smoke out of the walls before Lily arrived, and found them sitting very innocently on the balcony pretending everything had always been exactly like this. He talked about Harry himself, in the last year, the way James had carried him, one-armed, through arguments and conversations and Quidditch discussions. The way the carrying was so natural James clearly could not have told you he was doing it. The way Harry had slept through the argument about the Falmouth Falcons' defensive formation, with the absolute blankness of the thoroughly unconscious. And James had just kept gesturing with the hand that wasn't holding him, and Sirius had had to do his arguing with both arms, because James had an excuse. He talked about the face James had worn the last morning, the decided face, the face of a man who had looked at a situation and made his reckoning with it and arrived at the specific piece of someone who has chosen their position and is holding it. He talked for 43 minutes. He had been preparing a different speech for 2 years, and instead he talked about James, because James was what was true and James was what was irreplaceable, and James was the thing the magical world had made into a plaque and a memorial and a date in its history, and that Sirius needed, with the specific desperation of someone who has been the only living repository of something and has been carrying it alone, to give to someone who had the right to receive it. Harry listened, not with the listening of politeness, which is the listening that waits for its turn to speak, not with the listening of sympathy, which requires the management of the other person's emotion, with the listening that simply is, that receives without converting, that gives the speaker the experience of being heard the way stone gives the foundation the experience of being held, not by doing anything, but by being exactly what it is. Sirius wound down. The room had its silence back. He was sitting on the cold stone floor of someone else's tower at 3 in the morning, and he was lighter than he had been in 2 years, and he was also aware of the thing he had not said, and had been not saying for the whole 43 minutes, which was the thing the whole speech had been leading toward, and which he still did not know how to say. "I was supposed to look after him," he said. His voice had gone to its honest register, Below the bravado, below the acid, the register of a man who has run out of other registers. That was the job. That was the only job in the end, and he's dead. And I was in Azkaban for 12 years for a thing I didn't do, and by the time I got out you were. He looked at Harry. You were already whatever you are, and I don't know what the godfather of whatever you are is supposed to do. Harry looked at him for a long moment. James Potter made choices that led to his death, Harry said. He made them in the service of something he valued. The death was a consequence, not a verdict. He paused. You made a choice that led to Azkaban. You made it in the service of something you thought was clever, and it wasn't, and the consequence was 12 years. He said this with no judgment in it, the way he said everything as the thing it was, no more. The war made both of those choices more costly than they should have been, but neither of them is your debt to pay now. Sirius looked at him. At the silver eyes and the impossible hair and the lunar disk at the throat, and the hands that rested on the stone sill with the same ease as the moon resting in its arc. You sound like him, Sirius said softly. Harry received this, held it in the open space where his accounting of things resided. The unexpected information that the way he spoke, the particular quality of his directness, his refusal to decorate the truth that these were not only Selene's. That some of this was James Potter's, that a man he had never met had given him something he had been using all his life without knowing its origin. The accounting shifted. Something was entered into it that had not been there before. Not a feeling, not the way mortals felt feelings, the flood and the physical weight of it, but a register shift. A reorganization at the structural level. The kind of change that does not announce itself but that you discover later has changed everything it was near. He reached out and placed his hand on Sirius Black's shoulder. One contact, one deliberate pressure. Not warm, not the warm of human reassurance, which was a mortal technology he had not grown up with but present. The full presence of something that does not touch lightly, that when it makes contact makes it completely. Sirius went entirely still. Harry withdrew his hand. He turned back to the window. The moon was full overhead, his mother's patience, her watching, the light that had been his first and most constant thing. Sirius sat on the cold floor for a long time without speaking, and the silence around him was the listening silence still, and it was enough. Selene came at dawn. She did not come to the front gate or the entrance hall or any of the points of formal entry that Hogwarts maintained for visitors. She came to the courtyard on the west face, the one the groundskeeper kept in a state of aggressive practicality, rakes against the wall, a bin for gardening waste, the whole space dedicated to function rather than ceremony. She stood 2 inches above the flagstones, and the moon was behind her at 50 feet above the castle's tallest tower, which was not where the moon was supposed to be at dawn, and which did not care about supposed to. The wards registered her arrival the way a system registers an entity vastly in excess of its design parameters, not with alarm, which implies the capacity to respond, but with the silence of a thing that has recognized its own inadequacy and has decided the honest response is to become very still. Every ward on Hogwarts went entirely silent in sequence, from outermost to innermost, a cascade of cessation that took 11 seconds and that felt, to anyone sensitive enough to feel it, which included everyone in the building who had been practicing magic for more than a decade, like a room going quiet when the music stops. Dumbledore was in his office when it happened. He had been awake since the probe at midnight, which he had felt as a disturbance in the castle's ambient field, a ripple followed by a sharp absence that told him something had arrived and been refused. He had been sitting with his instruments and his thoughts since then, and when the wards went silent, he was already reaching for his outer robe. He came to the courtyard in 4 minutes. Dressed with care, his wand held at his side in the formal greeting position, pointed down, angled away in the particular posture that meant I am beginning nothing. He stepped into the courtyard and saw Selene and stopped. He had met gods before, not many, enough to know that the word impressive was the response of someone who had not yet understood what they were looking at. Selene was not impressive in the way a large building was impressive, or in the way a great piece of magic was impressive. She was actual, which was a different thing entirely. She was present in the way oceans are present, not by doing anything, but by being a thing whose nature had consequences. She looked at him the way oceans look at coastlines. "My son is unharmed," she said. "He is well," Dumbledore said, with the care of a man choosing every word. "He has been," he paused. "He has conducted himself with complete sovereignty since his arrival. The probe, yes," a pause. "He handled it without intervention from anyone. The corridor was dark for approximately 30 seconds. When the light returned, the probe was gone. Selene was quiet. The moon above the towers held its wrong position with the perfect indifference of something that does not recognize the concept of wrong when applied to its own location. "The fragment in the scar," she said. "You know about it." "I have suspected for some time," Dumbledore said carefully, "that there was a remnant of Voldemort's own magic lodged in Harry's scar. I have not been able to determine its nature with precision." "It is a piece of his soul," Selene said. The sentence landed with the weight of a geological fact, made deliberately, placed there by the rebounding curse. "He divided himself into pieces, your Dark Lord, to prevent his own death. The piece in the scar is one of 7. Dumbledore absorbed this in the way he absorbed large and costly information, by going very still and very quiet, by letting it settle through every layer of his understanding before he allowed himself to respond to it. 7, he said after a long moment. 6 others, Selene said. Dispersed. The locations are findable. The fragment in my son's scar cannot be removed by any method available to your discipline, because it is contained by something your discipline did not build and cannot replicate. She paused. It can be contained indefinitely, or it can be destroyed. Destroying it requires the destruction of the piece that made it, the piece still surviving in your Dark Lord's reconstituted body. Not the other way around. The scar fragment poses no threat as long as my son carries it. Should he choose to relinquish it, she stopped. The sentence completed itself in the silence. He would need to die, Dumbledore said quietly. A human would need to die, Selene said. My son is not exclusively human. The path is different. She looked at Dumbledore with the patient attention of something that has watched many very intelligent people construct the same error and is deciding how much to correct before the error becomes structural. You were going to tell him, she said, eventually, when you had determined the right moment. You were going to present the information as a necessary thing, prepared in a particular way, designed to lead him to a particular conclusion. Dumbledore said nothing, which was, in itself, a kind of answer. Tell him plainly, Selene said. Tell him what you know about the soul fragments. Tell him what you have been looking for and what you suspect and what you don't know. Give him the information as information, not as architecture. The immensity of her attention fixed him, held him with the specific regard of something that has run out of patience with a particular category of clever. He will determine his own response, and his response will be more useful to you than anything you could construct if you trust him to determine it. And if his determination is that this is not his war, Dumbledore said. Then it is not his war, Selene said, with the finality of something stating a law of nature. And you fight it without him and you lose, and the consequences are yours to carry. He did not make the war. He did not make the prophecy. He was put in the path of it at 15 months old by a man who was afraid of what he might become, and the world spent 17 years waiting for him to become it on your schedule. She was quiet for a moment. You do not get to demand the fulfillment of a destiny you assigned him without his consent. Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, with the eyes of a man looking at something he has known theoretically and is now encountering in its full actual weight. What do you want from this? He said, and the sentence had no strategy in it, no mechanism, no layer between the asking and the honest need to know. Selene looked at the tower. Harry was visible in the window distant, a dark figure against the window's gray light, watching, the lunar disk at his throat a point of silver. The look between mother and son crossed the courtyard without words. It had the quality of all communication between things that have lived together in absolute silence for 17 years. It contained everything that had never needed to be said, and everything that had been said, and everything that was still being said, and all of it was simultaneous, and none of it required Dumbledore to understand it. For my son to know what he is deciding, Selene said at last, and to decide it himself. She stepped back, up, The moon moved from its impossible position to its correct one in a motion that was mathematically precise and carried the quality of a door being properly closed after it has been standing open long enough to make the room cold. The motion took 4 seconds. She was gone. The wards came back online, outermost to innermost this time, reestablishing themselves in the careful sequence of a system resuming function after a planned pause. Dumbledore stood in the courtyard alone for a long time. He stood without a plan, which was a thing he rarely did, and looked at the space where she had been, and thought about what it meant to be one of the most powerful humans alive, and to have just been given instructions by something for which the word powerful was the wrong unit of measurement. He thought about the Horcruxes. He thought about the conversation he had been postponing. He went inside to prepare it honestly, which was not how he had originally planned to prepare it, and the not how was its own kind of progress. Harry was on the east balcony at 8 in the morning when Snape found him. Snape had been awake when the wards went silent. Snape was always awake when anything went silent. It was the occupational condition of a man who lived by reading the ambient, and had spent the subsequent hours in his dungeon conducting his own preparations, not for a conversation, but for the call he knew would come from Wiltshire. He came to the balcony because his feet made the decision, the way his feet had made the decision once before, and because he had found, since Harry's arrival, that his feet were becoming an increasingly reliable guide to where the significant conversations were happening. He stood in the doorway. "The Dark Lord will summon me," he said without preamble, because the preamble had been used up in the corridor outside the potions classroom. "Yes," Harry said. "He will want to know what I've seen." Snape moved to stand at the rail, a careful distance that was his version of proximity, the distance that said I am choosing to be near this thing rather than I have been placed here by circumstance. The grounds were coming into their morning condition, dew on the grass, the forest making its daytime adjustments, the sky thin and clear. He will use legilimency. He will look for hesitation, for prepared answers, for any gap between what I say and what I actually know. "I know," Harry said. "The question," Snape said, "is what I actually know." Harry looked at the forest. The centaurs were in the northern section. He could sense the particular astral frequency of their magic, the bright prophetic signal, quieter than it had been last night but still there, still reading something in the sky that hadn't become a sentence yet. "Tell him the truth," Harry said. "You have observed me for 10 days. I am of divine origin, half-Titan. The scar fragment is inert and inaccessible. I have attended 2 classes and spoken with the headmaster and the head of Slytherin, and have made no declarations of allegiance to any side of the current conflict." He paused. "I have refused ministry registration. I have not drawn a wand because I do not carry one." Snape looked at him sideways. "That last piece he will find interesting." "Yes," Harry said. "Let him find it interesting. Interesting is a condition that produces questions, and questions are conditions that produce delay, and delay is useful to me." Snape absorbed this. He looked at the grounds, at the frost on the grass that the morning sun was beginning to address. "He will ask whether you are a threat. Tell him you don't know," Harry said. "That is the truth. You don't know. I haven't told you. The honest answer to whether I am a threat is that the category depends on what he does, which is also true, and which you can tell him because the knowing of it will not help him." He turned to look at Snape directly. "He will push you. He always pushes his spies at the limits of their reporting. He does it to test the seams, to find the places where what they say and what they feel diverge. You have survived his legilimency for 20 years because you are genuinely able to hold 2 true things simultaneously and present the one that serves your purpose. You are very well informed about my survival techniques," Snape said, "and the acid was present, but it was the thinner kind, the kind that is deployed for form rather than for genuine deflection." "You are a remarkable spy," Harry said, not with warmth, with the assessment quality he gave to precise things. "The position is genuinely extraordinary. Most people cannot maintain that kind of structural division for 20 years. The ones who can are the ones whose division is not a performance but a real feature of their psychology. You are genuinely 2 things simultaneously. That is not a failure of integrity. It is a specific and remarkable architecture." Snape looked at the frost on the grass. His jaw performed its specific event. "The Dark Lord has begun to understand that I am not what he expected," Harry said. The probe told him the fragment is in amber. He is rebuilding his assessment. Part of that rebuild is testing every information source he has, including you. The information I've given you is the information I want him to have, not because it hides anything, but because the complete true picture of the situation is more disorienting to him than any false picture would be. He paused. The truth that I am not his enemy yet is more frightening to him than the lie that I am. Snape looked at him then, the full look, the one without the acid layer or the armor layer or the careful professional distance. The look of a man who has just understood the shape of something he did not expect to be shaped like that. "Yet," he said. "Yet," Harry said, "the grounds breathed their morning cold." Below them the school was waking, the sounds of it reaching the balcony as a low, organized hum, the sound of 400 people beginning their day in the specific community of a place that had been waking the same way for 4 centuries. Snape straightened. He pulled the outer robe across his chest, not the gesture of cold, but the gesture of resuming the exterior configuration. "The boomslang skin," he said. He said it with the dry precision of a man choosing to reestablish tone on his own terms. "I replaced it. The 4th years are adequately resourced." Harry's mouth moved. It was not a smile, in the way mortal expressions of amusement were smiles. It was something more minimal than that, a fractional change in the line of his mouth that carried the weight of what a smile carried without the performance of one. The recognition of something that had been offered plainly. "Good," he said. Snape left the balcony without another word, which was his way of completing conversations that had gone to their proper depth, not ending them, but releasing them, the way you release a thing you have held with full attention when the holding is finished. Harry turned back to the view. The grounds held their morning frost. The forest stood at its edge with the patience of things that have decided to wait and mean it. Above the forest, the sky was the specific blue of a September morning that has decided to be generous, clear from horizon to horizon, the sun still low and cold. He placed his hand on the stone of the parapet. The stone was old, 311 years of Scottish winter in its grain, the cold that had come before him and would continue after him, the cold of geological fact rather than weather, the permanent mineral truth of a thing that had decided to be stone a very long time ago and had seen no reason to revise that decision. His palm against it, the stone's weight and density meeting his palm, meeting the hand of something that was not stone and was not mortal and was not the moon and was not exactly human but was also not exactly not. Pressure meeting pressure. He pressed. The stone held. He had known it would hold. He had stood at this parapet twice before and made this same contact, and the stone had always held. But the knowing was not the same as the confirming, and the confirming was something he needed, again now. On this morning after the probe and the 43 minutes of James Potter's voice through Sirius Black's throat, and his mother standing in the courtyard below with 50 feet of moon at her back. He was here. He had decided to be here. The decision had been made on the moon with his mother's hand against his face, and the deciding had been his, and the being here was his, and the parapet was cold and certain under his palm, and neither of them moved. Below him Hogwarts breathed. In Wiltshire, Voldemort sat very still in his high-backed chair and looked at nothing, and built his new framework with the patient exactness of a man who has survived long enough to understand that haste was what killed people who were otherwise too dangerous to kill. In the amber of the silver scar, the fragment sat in its suspension and was, for the first and only time since its imprisonment, afraid. Not of Harry, not of Selene. Afraid of the specific cold quality of the decision being assembled around it. The decision that had no urgency in it, no heat, no mortal need to resolve. The decision of something that could wait as long as it needed to wait, and would. Harry looked at the sky. The moon was not visible. It was on the other side of the world now, doing its appointed work on tides that would never know it had stood 50 feet above a castle at dawn to confirm that its child was intact. He did not need to see it to know it was there. It had always been there. That was the thing about the moon. The stone held the pressure of his hand, and the hand held the pressure of the stone, and the morning continued, and the war waited, as all wars wait, with the terrible patience of things that do not need any individual to agree to them in order to proceed. and Harry stood at the parapet in the thin September light and looked at the sky his mother lived in, and thought about the Longbottom parents and Sirius Black's loose ring and Snape's 20 years of structural division, and Dumbledore preparing an honest conversation for the first time, perhaps, in a very long time. He thought about all of it. He was deciding, not today, not this morning, but the architecture was assembling itself in the space where his decisions lived, beam by beam, stone by stone, with the patience of something that builds to last rather than builds to finish. The war was real. The cost of it was real. The people in it were real, fragile and urgent and brief and entirely serious about their brevity, the way mortals were serious about their brevity, which was the one thing about them that Harry had never been able to treat as alien. They were brief. They mattered the way brief things mattered completely in their moment without the consolation of sequel. He pressed the stone. The stone pressed back. Something in the architecture clicked into place. Not the whole thing, not the final form of the decision, but something fundamental, something load-bearing, something that would hold the weight of what came next. The morning went on. So did he.